Welcome back to the virtual hanger. Today I'm going to show you how to cross stitch with this motivational cross stitch sampler. Your kit will include one piece of 18 count aida cloth, one cross stitch needle, one skein of black embroidery thread, as well as some metallic silver and some metallic gold, one 7-inch embroidery hoop, and 3 pages of the paper pattern. I have one that has a cuss and one, if you're not about cussing, that's fine. You want to go a little more traditional. And then one piece that also has a bunch of alphabets in case you want to draft your own pattern. So we're going to start by finding the center of our cloth. This is called, I checked, it's pronounced aida, like the musical, or aida. It kind of depends on who you ask. We're going to fold it into quarters and find the center and then mark it with a pencil so that we can find the middle here. Then we are going to take just a scrap piece of thread you have, anything. This is just in case you don't want the pencil to live on your piece forever. And I'm just going to cross over, go from the back to the front, leave a little bit of a tail, go up and then back down. I'm putting a little plus sign on the direct center of our fabric. I just tie it in a loose overhand knot. You can cut it off later, just so that it stays, so that we know where the center of our pattern is. So we are matching the fabric grid to our paper grid. You'll notice I didn't start by putting the fabric in the hoop. If you've never done any stitching, you may want to check out this early stitching video I did, and that'll show you how to load it in the hoop. But let's take a look at some embroidery floss here. On other projects we've done, we've used all 6 strands. Most embroidery floss comes in basically 6 threads that you can kind of pull apart like this. For this project, you can either use 3 at a time or 2 at a time. You do 3 if you want the color to be really thick, and use 2 if you want the X's to be very defined. It just depends on how you want it to go. I usually stitch with about 18 inches or less. So you want to cut your working piece of thread to however long you want it to be, like I said, 18 to 12 inches, and then separate it carefully into the 2 strands or 3 strands. We are going to thread the needle with our 2 threads and set the rest of the embroidery floss that we cut aside. Let's talk about how to make these X's. This is all cross stitching is. Whenever I do a cross stitch, I start from the bottom left, I go up to the top right. So that would be the 2 o'clock angle. We are going to then go from the back side, the bottom right, pull the thread all the way through, and then go to the top left. So the hallmark of good cross stitch, air quotes around good, right? You don't always have to start from the bottom left. You can start from the top right and go down to the bottom left. You could also do it the opposite. It will still be an X. However, if you were entering your work in a state fair or something, you would always want the X's to overlap in the same way. So that means the 2 o'clock sort of X would be on the bottom and the 10 o'clock would be on the top. You can see here in this what it looks like when you do the other direction, when you put the other one on the bottom and the other one on top. Not a great audio description of it, but hopefully it's easier to see what I mean. And as you're actually doing this, though, you will notice that the fabric is extremely small and the thread is extremely small. So it'll be pretty difficult to tell if you do have it in the wrong direction. All that's to say, don't sweat it. That's technically what you're going for, but just remember you can be flexible. The only goal is the X. So I've taken the pattern here and I've done a count. I'm trying to get to the black line. I'm going to start with the border and I'm going to count up 44 squares. Each of the big squares is 9 on the paper pattern, but there is a box to represent each little box here on the fabric itself. Aida cloth has a very even weave, which makes it great for cross stitching because it makes your X's very consistent, and there's a hole in between the couple of sections of thread that actually make up the fabric. As you're counting, I wouldn't mark with a pencil necessarily, but give your needle a little wiggle and that can help you count, 10 or whatever. So I'm going to start the first stitch here on the border. I don't tie a knot in the back of my cross stitch. The thing about cross stitching is because the stitches are so consistent, you can actually cross the needle over the tail on the back side of the fabric and kind of trap it. And that will keep your work nice and flat, and you don't have to worry about tying a little tiny knot. So you can see after I do my first couple of X's here, how it catches the back end of the needle. Now, obviously you have to be careful when you're starting stitching. You don't want to pull so hard that you pull the tail out. I did that probably 300 times making this piece, but just keep an eye on it. You can, as we start the work, either choose to do one stitch at a time, one X at a time, or I've counted that it's 10 stitches to the end of this kind of section. So I'm going to do all of the slashes going in the 2 o'clock direction, and then I will go back to where I began with the 10 o'clock direction and finish this whole row at once. It can be a little bit faster to do it that way, and it gets into kind of a larger discussion about cross stitching, which I can't wait to start, about pathing. What that means is, because the stitches in cross stitch are so simple, it's literally just the one X. A lot of the technique of cross stitching comes from thinking about where the next stitch is going to start, counting your pattern, seeing, okay, this section has a chunk of this many stitches. I need to go from the bottom left to the top left. You can see the back is quite neat. As you continue around, you want to try and minimize the distance that you have to travel with the needle on the back side of the work and maximize the distance that you need to travel with the needle on the front side of the work, right? Because you don't want to waste thread. You're going to use a lot of these 18-inch cuts. So as you can see, I finish one. I just tuck it right under those neat stitches on the back side. I don't tie a knot. I cut it. You can cut it really close. And then the next thread that you thread onto the needle, when we finish our first thread, we can actually do the same thing to start it. So you can tuck it under 2 or 3 stitches on the back side. Again, being careful on the first stitch that you do, that you're not pulling it all the way through to the front, which I did do, again, about 400 billion times as I was doing this piece. But just leaving enough, a couple of millimeters so that you're not worried about it, and letting the tension of your stitches hold the thread. In kind of an old school way, that is helpful to keep your work nice and flat when you put it in a frame or you use it as a bookmark or whatever. A lot of modern stitchers just leave their pieces in the hoop, so it doesn't matter as much. If you want to tie knots and you're more comfortable that way, go for it. That's totally fine. I found it easiest to start with the black circle and do this sort of count. I did the black all the way around before I started with the metallic thread so that you get comfortable doing the X's. Let's talk about this metallic thread. So it kind of wants to separate into 4 sections made of 3 threads each. It's made of 12, but I ended up working with 1/4 of that, which is actually made of these 3 tiny threads. I'm not going to lie to you, this metallic thread is a little bit difficult to work with, but one of my tricks is I took one of those individual threads for the section and just made a little tiny, the first half of a lark's head knot. That probably doesn't mean anything. Just a little overhand knot that goes around with one of the threads, so it's a very slim knot, and then I put that knotted end through the needle when I work with it, and I also use a smaller piece of thread, only about 12 inches. So I'm going to start stitching the border here with the metallic thread, and we're going to talk a little bit more about pathing and try and get you comfortable. So the idea of pathing is to minimize the amount of thread that you use, right? You don't want to go from one side of the piece all the way to the other to do an X and then go back all the way to the other side you started with. We're trying to use as little thread as possible on the back side. That keeps your pieces slim. They're not all knotted on the back. So these are a couple that I'm showing you how I went about doing them. The shortest path is always going to be on the short end of the square, right? The one of the sides. After that, the next shortest is the single diagonal. So that's, if you're a math person, that's the hypotenuse. That's going to be a little bit longer than the side of the square. The longest is 2 holes away, right? So we're going to go from the top of a previous stitch all the way to the bottom of the next stitch. but it's like a couple squares away. As much as possible, you want to stay close to where you're working so that you don't have to take your thread very far away from the stitches that you are currently doing. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense, but if not, this can kind of show you the path that I took and how that helped. Again, if you are really confused by the pathing, it doesn't make any sense, you don't want to worry about it, don't worry about it. Just make sure that you are on the black using the 2 threads instead of the 3 threads, and you will definitely have enough thread to finish the project. So, but you can see I did the big gold piece, the big triangle before moving to the corner. I did the silver, and then on that foundation, I did the other bits of gold. And then I was able to put those silver loops in between the gold. That's kind of how the pattern is stacked. I went with this kind of Art Deco theme to try and be a little bit more gender neutral for everybody. And all of the corners are perfectly symmetrical. So hopefully you can do one corner and then you won't necessarily have to carry the paper pattern with you wherever you go. And once I was done with the metallic thread, I started using the black to do the lines on the outside. And you can see the finished border here. This is definitely a couch project. It's a purse project. Let's start in the middle. I'm going to show you how to draft your own pattern in case you don't like mine. And I gave you all of these little alphabets to start with and the copy of the circle here, which I'm going to cut separate from the paper. And then I'm going to use a pencil and an eraser to go over and see the letters that I like if I have a different message I want to make. I'm going to write a message here. So I count the number of squares in each letter to make sure that it will fit inside of the circle, which is the circle that you just stitched from the border, right? Once I do that, I count the heights of each letter to kind of see how big they are. I can do the letters here to add all those numbers together and see how many squares I need to get it, to make sure, first of all, that it fits in the circle that we just stitched, give them a little bit of space, and then also to see where the middle is. I take all of the squares total, divided by 2, that gives me the middle. An embarrassing long time to do this math right here, but it is 26.5-ish on each side of the center to do that. So then I can look at my circle and kind of compare here to see, okay, if you hold this up to a light, you'll be able to see a little bit better, but you can take the circle graph paper here and lay it over the alphabet letters and just trace right over it if you can see it. I did end up having a little bit of a difficult time, but I am a very kind of square-minded person, so I ended up not tracing most of the letters and instead just coloring them in by counting them the same way we did from stitching. So once I get started, it's a lot easier once you've started the first letter. I just sort of count and fill it in, shade it in with my pencil until I get all the letters I want on there. The alphabet part doesn't have all of the squares. Each of the squares there represents 3, but it is to scale, so it will match if you want to lay the circle over any of the alphabet. And I give you a couple different fonts to just kind of give you some options. So you can see the way that I am taking each letter, copying it over to my pattern, and then coloring it in with my pencil. You make a mistake, just erase it. That's totally fine. And once I am just about done with that, I get all of my letters on. I really think it's funny to do kind of like a snarky cross stitch. I know that's extremely like 2010 of me, but it's such an old style of art cross stitch. It feels very much like something my grandma would do. I think it's funny to pair it with something really modern, like a very silly message. You can see I started switching to outlines here by the end, but I just take a thick marker and color it in once I have it drafted, so that I don't lose any of that great work I just did when the pencil inevitably runs off the paper. The marker just gives it a little bit more longevity, makes it easier to see, so it's kind of nice. There are also tools you can use online to generate patterns, so just make sure if you do that, you're doing it for 18 count cloth, which just means that there's 18 squares per inch of the fabric. So there's my drafted pattern. Again, you're free to do that, or you can just use the one I did. Let's talk about that really fast. You can either go all slashes from one end of a letter back around, or you can just do kind of one stitch at a time to go from one side to the other. I found on the big letters, it was easier for me to do it like one row at a time. I tried to do, as you can see, the big E here, and I found it a little bit difficult to see which ones I had done or not done to get to the next row. It's a little harder to find the holes when I did it that way. So it's totally preference, up to you. But once we're done stitching our message, that's it. I'm not gonna lie, this took me a great long time. I'll show you really quickly here how I finish this off. I just stitch each of the 4 corners. When I get back to where I started, I actually take the needle and make a little X after I've pulled it tight. That kind of just helps keep the tension. But the fabric's really stiff, so it doesn't take a lot to keep it in the hoop. Once I tie my little overhand knot here, I am just going to trim the thread. If you need more help on this, again, check out a previous video that we've done for embroidery. But there you have it. If you made it this far, you're powerful. I love you. You did a great job. I'd love to see what you make. Please reach out to us on social media, and I will see you next time.